The question of survival among Black girls has always been about whether they are seen, particularly in economically and socially isolated spaces. This quote is difficult to read simply because it lets us know how African American women often have no community behind them, making it 10 times harder for them and putting their future at stake. Morris lets us know throughout the story that when they are ignored, success becomes difficult for them. From my understanding, this means invisibility is one of the main dangers African American girls face. It is more than just being seen, it is about being heard, represented, and valued. If you do not recognize their struggles, it becomes easy to ignore them. Not only do they face challenges at school, but also at home and on social media. We see this in Push Out, where girls were being punished for behaviors that actually signaled they were crying out for help. African American women are often silent because they are invisible and taught to be strong, and even expected to always appear strong. This matters because everyone deserves to be valued, represented, heard, and visible. It is a constant battle for African American girls. This matters because it is our country, and it shows how we are constantly failing children of color. Imagine if we valued children of color, how many lives it would change and build. It is about recognition, and sometimes one person can change an entire student's life. Let's be the change and ensure we are doing our part.
After reading the article from Monique Morris, Push Out, the Criminalization of Black Girls in School, there was a definite issue that was prominent throughout the article, and that was how policing was lacking in its trust in its community of color. We learn from Morris's article that Black girls are treated and judged unfairly in comparison to males or even white males. Black girls are to uphold a certain standard and follow a certain order. And if they were to go against this order, they can be seen as dirty and ghetto, causing fear and even resentment within the girls. This is also seen in the LA 92 murders as well, and as mentioned, continues to cause fear. In accordance to the SARA model, we are able to scan that it can be prominent within schools or neighborhoods, and the community could help in identifying these spots. When analyzing, we can see that lack in communication or assistance within our police and maybe community can be a big factor in why this is occurring. In response, we could have better policing after some training and have more connections with the community to prevent misunderstandings and offer better interactions and trust. In assess, if the positive changes continue and persist, we can see positive results in incidents, complaints, and also in how the community begins to react in response to a better environment in comparison to how it previously was. Addressing the issue can help repair relationships and provide a safer environment for the young Black girls and everyone as well. It takes everyone to make a community greater, and with good effort and understanding, this can be achieved.
After reading Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, I came to understand how school discipline often causes more harm than good, especially for students of color. Morris shows that Black girls are frequently labeled as defiant, loud, or aggressive, even when their behavior is a response to unfair treatment, emotional stress, or situations happening in their lives. Instead of asking why a student is acting a certain way, many schools rely on punishment like suspensions, expulsions, or school-based arrests. This process pushes students out of learning environments and increases their chances of entering the juvenile justice system, which Morris refers to as push out. As a parent of young girls, this issue feels personal to me. I have seen how children's behavior is often misunderstood. When kids act out, it is usually because something deeper is going on. They may feel ignored, frustrated, or hurt. My own first-grade daughter has already dealt with boys picking on her at school. Situations like this show why children need emotional support and guidance from both teachers and parents. I believe respect must be taught early, especially to young boys, so they grow up understanding boundaries and empathy. Every child deserves to feel safe, valued, and heard. This issue can be addressed using the SARA model scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. Instead of reacting with punishment, schools should first scan for patterns in discipline, analyze the root causes, respond with support such as counseling or restorative circles, and then assess progress. If schools focused on understanding students instead of criminalizing them, they could prevent unnecessary punishment, keep kids in classrooms, and build trust between students and educators.
After reading Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, I read that many young Black girls were categorized incorrectly if they acted a certain way. If they were to speak out for themselves, they were considered loud. At the same time, Black girls are set forth certain expectations that sometimes seem sexist because women are expected to act a certain way, but when they act the same way as men, which is perfectly accepted by society, they could be labeled negatively. It could be confusing for a young Black girl to see that men can act a certain way, but when it comes to women, if they act the same, people view them negatively. This potentially could create a source of rebellion and confusion for young girls because men are not held to the same standard as women. There are many problems that we have to address in our community, as well as much of the time throughout American history. Black minorities have been ignored and oftentimes even abused by the same people who are supposed to protect them. During the 1990s in LA, many Black girls and women were murdered. Most of these cases remain unsolved. In most of these cases, law enforcement put in little effort to solve them. If it were to have been a white girl being murdered, then that result more than likely would have been different. We, as law enforcement, have to set a better example. Many recent California laws regarding policing have helped law enforcement connect with minorities better, but we need to continue to strive for better policing.
One of the challenges I noticed in policing today is a consistent lack of trust between law enforcement and communities of color. If we reflect back on LA 92, we see the hostility and tension between the police and community during the Rodney King riots. The resentment and uneven justice that these communities felt was evident in the violence of those 3 days. Similar problems still exist today, particularly with racial profiling, excessive use of force, and the criminalization of youth in schools. In Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, Monique Morris talks about how young Black girls are being seen as threats instead of students who need more support or direction. This attitude is causing these students to be pushed out of their classrooms and into the juvenile justice system, and shows that crime prevention needs to happen well before a criminal arrest. By using SARA, scanning, analysis, response, and assessment, we can better address this problem. Scanning has to do with identifying that certain students are affected by the disciplinary practices and bias that goes into youth interactions. Analysis would be recognizing that zero-tolerance policies and expectations about conduct result in a revolving door of punishment rather than support. Response would involve creating opportunities for restorative justice, mentoring, and culture training for school staff and officers. Assessment means keeping track of suspension rates and student success to see if there is any improvement. The victims of this problem are the students, and more specifically the young Black girls, who are being profiled as offenders rather than victims of a system that is biased against them. Addressing this issue is about redefining the relationships between youth, schools, and the police, and finding opportunities for prevention, understanding, and chance rather than retribution.
After reading Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, one of the main ideas that really stood out to me was the mentioning how, when Black girls rebel against these expectations, they risk being labeled a bad girl, a ghetto girl, or, in more recent vernacular, ratchet. There's been so many expectations set for Black girls that the second they are not met, it goes to immediate judgment by others around them. The whole system is set up in such a way where these Black women, Chuchin girls, cannot afford to make mistakes due to the fact that any small situation can land them in jail or moved homes. Applying the SARA model means being able to identify why these harsh expectations were set in place to begin with. It also means setting up programs in the education system, or even just teachers, officers, or anyone that helps other individuals know how to look past these expectations. This can all tie in as well into how the criminal justice system needs to be willing to be more helpful towards younger Black individuals. There needs to be less jumping towards over-punishment and willingness to build trust with minority communities to build a healthier, more trusty, worthy relationship. This gives the opportunity to try to get to know the issue first regarding minorities instead of law enforcement immediately jumping in with a warrior mindset. It's a matter of breaking down these stereotypes in order to work towards a less tense relationship between minority groups and the criminal justice system. After reading Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, one of the main problems I see is how policing both in communities and in schools continues to reflect systemic racial bias. The film LA 92 showed how police brutality and racial profiling have long created distrust between law enforcement and communities of color, especially Black residents of Los Angeles. This same pattern of control and punishment extends into schools, where Morris explains how Black girls are often labeled defiant or aggressive for behaviors that are actually expressions of frustration or resistance to discrimination. The problem I'm focusing on solving is the criminalization of youth of color in schools through harsh discipline and the presence of school police. I plan to approach this using the SARA model, scanning, analysis, response, and assessment, by first identifying how often suspensions, expulsions, or arrests target specific student groups. Scanning, then analyzing why these policies persist. Analysis such as bias, lack of teacher training, or zero-tolerance rules. My response would involve recommending restorative justice programs and teacher training in culturally responsive discipline response, followed by assessing whether those changes reduce disparities assessment. The people suffering from this problem are primarily students of color, especially girls who are treated as offenders rather than children who need support. They are the victims of systemic bias and institutional neglect. By reforming school policing and disciplinary policies, we can shift from punishment to understanding and support, preventing the school-to-prison pipeline and fostering equity in education.
Reading Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris hit me hard. It shows how schools often label Black girls as loud or aggressive for simply expressing themselves or reacting to tough situations. Instead of asking why they're acting out, schools jump to punishment, suspensions, detentions, or even arrests. Morris calls this push out, where the system gives up on these girls rather than helping them thrive. As a dad of girls, I see acting out as a cry for attention, good or bad. My first grader has faced boys picking on her, and I believe boys need to learn early to treat girls with respect. Every boy has a mom, so they should get it. Schools and parents both have a role in teaching this. If we don't, kids' behaviors, often shaped by home or their environment, just get worse. This ties to the SARA model: scanning, analysis, response, and assessment. It's about understanding the root of a kid's behavior before reacting. Maybe they're dealing with trauma or feeling ignored. Analyzing first could cut down on harsh punishments, like suspensions. It's about seeing the kid, not just the rule they broke. If schools used SARA, they'd keep more kids in class, build trust, and stop labeling them as problems too soon. This human-centered approach could help kids grow instead of pushing them out, giving them a fair shot at success.
So after watching LA 92 and reading the excerpt from Monique Morris's Push Out: The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, I think one of the biggest issues in policing today is the lack of trust between police and communities of color. Both the film and the book show how people, especially young Black girls, are often treated unfairly or judged before anyone really tries to understand them. That kind of treatment doesn't just cause anger, it creates this ongoing cycle of fear, frustration, and disconnection. Using the SARA model, here's how I'd look at solving it. Scan. First, figure out where these trust issues are happening the most. It could be in schools, certain neighborhoods, or just areas where people feel over-policed. Talking to the community and looking at local reports would help identify those spots. Analyze. Then ask why this is happening. Is it lack of training, bias, or just bad communication? In Push Out, Morris shows how Black girls are often punished for things that really just need understanding or support. That's a huge part of the problem. Respond. I'd start with better training for officers and school staff, especially on bias and how to handle situations calmly. Creating spaces where youth and police can actually talk could help too. Sometimes people just need to feel heard. Assess. Lastly, see if those changes actually help. Track school incidents, complaints, and how people feel about police interactions. In this situation, the ones suffering most are young Black students, mainly girls, who are seen as troublemakers when they're really just dealing with tough environments.
Both LA 92 and Monique Morris's Pushout. The criminalization of Black girls in schools, the main issue that stands out is how the justice system and education system often work against people of color instead of helping them. The problem I want to focus on is the lack of trust between law enforcement and minority communities, which continues to create fear, tension, and a cycle of injustice. In LA 92, we saw how the Rodney King beating and the riots that followed were not just reactions to one event, but the result of years of police brutality and racial inequality. Morris's excerpt connects to this by showing how those same patterns start early in schools, where Black girls are often labeled defiant or aggressive for behaviors that are overlooked in other students. Instead of being supported, they face suspensions, expulsions, and arrests, which pushes them into the criminal justice system and feeds the school-to-prison pipeline. The people who suffer the most from this problem are young Black girls who are treated like offenders when they are actually victims of systemic bias. Solving this problem requires more empathy and awareness from both schools and law enforcement. Teachers and officers need to be trained to handle situations with understanding instead of punishment. Restorative justice programs, mentorship, and better communication between schools and police could help rebuild trust and give students the guidance they need. Real change means seeing these kids not as problems, but as young people who deserve to be understood and supported.
Racial and gender bias that is still present in policing today is one of the biggest issues in policing, as it persists to this day and still influences the treatment of certain groups of people, in particular the youth of color, by the criminal justice and the educational systems. Having read LA 92 and Pushout, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, one can easily guess that the historical trends of discrimination and over-policing are transformed into the new ones. This issue can be better understood and addressed through the use of the SARA model. Scanning. The issue is the over-punishment and criminalization of Black and brown students, especially girls, whenever they engage in actions that frequently go unreported in other students. Such disciplinary measures put them at a higher risk of going into the justice system rather than getting an educational aid. Analysis. This problem is a result of implicit bias, cultural ignorance, and the institutional culture that equates defiance to danger. Trauma, poverty, and social inequality that determine student behavior are usually overlooked by schools and the law enforcement. Response. Schools and police departments should work together to solve this by implementing trauma-informed practices, programs of restorative justice, and anti-bias training. The tension can be also lowered by building trust based on the mentorship and positive engagement, and making students safer without criminalizing them. Measurement. The effectiveness of these solutions should be compared through the decrease in the number of suspensions, arrests, and racial inequity in discipline, as well as increasing the graduation rates and the satisfaction of students. The most affected group in this issue is the Black girls and other disadvantaged youth. They have been victims of institutional neglect and misunderstanding as opposed to perpetrators. Once we realize this, we will be one step further to just and caring systems of justice and education.
One of the larger problems in policing today is continued criminalization of young people, Black girls and other students of color, within schools and communities. As Monique Morris demonstrates in Pushout, many Black girls are being disciplined or arrested for behaviors that are symptoms of trauma or social forces and not criminal intent. These young women are too often defiant or aggressive, with resulting suspensions, expulsions, and arrests instead of counseling or guidance. This issue is part of a broader set of issues of systemic racism and unequal treatment that have long been an aspect of policing, as illustrated in LA 92, where tension and mistrust of the police by communities of color exploded into violence after decades of deprivation. Using the SARA model, we can plan to solve this issue. Scanning. Set the trend of over-policing and harsh discipline against black girls in schools. Analysis. Look at school discipline disparities data and listen to student voices in order to identify underlying factors like implicit bias and lack of support resources. Response. Train school resource officers and teachers on trauma-informed care, cultural competence, and restorative justice practices. Assessment. Measure success through tracking decreases in suspensions and arrest, as well as increases in graduation and well-being rates. The victims of this problem are primarily students, black girls specifically, who are victims of institutional racism instead of perpetrators. The remedy for this issue will have to include the partnership of police, teachers, parents, and community leaders to replace punishment with prevention, empathy, and nurturing.
Black women are approximately 3 times more likely to face imprisonment compared to white women, with 1 in 19 black women expected to be incarcerated at some stage in her life. This statement from Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, by Monique Morris, underscores a troubling reality regarding racial disparities in the U.S. criminal justice system. It emphasizes that despite black women constituting a smaller segment of the population, they experience incarceration at markedly higher rates than their white counterparts. The author's intention is to convey that systemic racism persists in determining who is categorized as a criminal in the United States. Black women frequently face harsher judgments, are deprived of fairness, and are situated in circumstances where their actions are criminalized, while similar behaviors in others may be overlooked or excused. This disproportionate representation is not indicative of crime statistics. It reflects bias, limited opportunities, and enduring historical inequalities that continue to influence the justice system. It implies that the imposition of punishment is unevenly applied, not due to a higher degree of wrongdoing, but as a result of social and institutional biases.
This is significant to me, as it highlights the failure of the justice system, which is meant to embody fairness, in protecting the very individuals it purports to serve. For generations, black women have made invaluable contributions to this nation, yet they continue to experience systemic exclusion and punishment rather than receiving the protection and support they deserve. On a larger scale, this issue is important. Globally, as it reveals how countries that boast about their commitment to equality often conceal profound structural injustices. If America aspires to be recognized as a leader in freedom and justice, it must address and rectify these disparities. Genuine crime prevention and community healing can only commence when every individual, particularly those who have been historically marginalized, is treated with dignity, equity, and respect in accordance with the law.
When I read Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools by Monique Morris, what stood out to me most was how schools treat certain behaviors as criminal instead of trying to understand where they come from. Morris explains how black girls are often labeled as loud, aggressive, or disrespectful, when a lot of the time, they're just expressing themselves or reacting to something that's happened in their lives. Instead of finding the reason behind the behavior, schools jump to punishment, suspensions, detentions, or even arrests. She calls this being pushed out, because the system ends up giving up on them, rather than helping them succeed. As a dad of girls, I've noticed that when kids act out, it's usually a cry for attention. Good or bad, they just want to be noticed. Sometimes that behavior is learned from home or their environment. I've seen it firsthand with my first grader. Some boys have been picking on her, and I honestly believe young boys should be taught from an early age how to treat girls with respect and kindness. Whether or not they have sisters or female cousins, they all have a mom, and that alone should teach them to be more mindful about how they treat females. Schools and parents both have a role in shaping that mindset. This all ties back to the SARA model: scanning, analysis, response, and assessment, which focuses on understanding the why behind the problem before reacting to it. Instead of immediately punishing kids, teachers and school officers could look deeper to identify what's causing the behavior. Maybe that student is struggling at home, feeling unseen, or reacting to trauma. By analyzing before responding, schools could prevent so many unnecessary suspensions or expulsions. It's about seeing the human side instead of just enforcing the rule book. If we approached school discipline with that mindset, we'd keep more kids in the classroom, build stronger trust, and stop labeling them as problems before giving them a fair chance to grow.